Hey, thank you for watching. In this video, I will talk about different innovative ways to research European security integration. My name is Kamil Zwolski. I am Associate Professor in International Politics at the University of Southampton in the UK. I'm also Jean Monnet Chair in European Security Governance. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to share with you a series of mini lectures about my forthcoming book. It is titled Researching European Security Integration. In this video, I will explain the idea of the book. I will tell you what it is about. I will share with you the table of contents, and I will say a few words about its original contribution. So the idea of this book, Researching European Security Integration, is kind of twofold. There are two main contributions of this book. The first idea is to analyze some key aspects of European security governance, and especially to take into account developments since the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which began in February 2022. I was working on that book before this full-scale invasion, and after the invasion, I had to go back, take another look at some of the chapters, and luckily I had enough time before the deadline for submitting the book to take all those kind of changes, all those new developments into account and integrate them into the analysis. The second idea of the book is methodological, and the idea of the book is really to challenge the kind of standard ways of conducting research in European studies. Now, from this perspective, the book might be interested to the broader group of academic teachers, researchers, experts working on European studies, not just necessarily in the field of European security and security integration. And I will talk a little bit more about this methodological contribution of the book later in the video. But first, I will outline the table of contents for the book. Before I do that, another thing that I should also mention here is that my work on this book has been supported by the European Union, the European Union's Jean Monnet Chair grant that I received back in 2019, and more recently, Jean Monnet module. So coming back to the table of contents, the first chapter is an introductory chapter where I explain the methodological contribution of the book. I'll talk a little bit more about it later. And then the second chapter is the kind of substantive chapter. It is called Stopping the Clock. Has European security evolved since the end of Cold War? So in this chapter and subsequent videos in this series of mini lectures, each will tackle each of the chapters of the book. So in this chapter, it's chapter 2, I talk about the story of evolution of European security governance, European security integration. When we talk about European security since the end of the Cold War, we often talk about the evolution of European security, right? When we talk about NATO strategic concepts, when we talk about different versions of European Union security strategy from 2003, 2008, or 2016, we talk about the evolution, right? Finally, when we talk about the actual events of European security, the wars following the breakup of Yugoslavia, the September 11 attacks on the United States, subsequent terrorist attacks in Europe, the war in Ukraine, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the war in Ukraine, the war in Georgia earlier. We talk about the evolution of European security. So in this chapter, Stopping the Clock, has European security evolved since the end of Cold War? I propose that we can perhaps change the way we frame this issue, and we can in fact argue that European security has not evolved that much since the end of the Cold War. In fact, we can argue that this has been a pretty static element in European security. And there are different ways we can do it, and I will talk about that more in the next video. Chapter 3 is called Imagining the Functional Model of European Security, and it draws on this conceptual kind of methodology called counterfactuals, right? So we try to imagine how things would have developed if something kind of alternative situation happened in the past. For example, what if there was no Adolf Hitler, or what if Adolf Hitler was assassinated before he reached power in Germany? Would Germany still lead to the outbreak of the Second World War, right? Those are questions that historians sometimes like to engage with. Now, in this chapter, I want to revisit the model of European integration. So what I want to see here is how would have European security look like after the Cold War if European integration took a different form than it actually took. So the European integration proceeded according to the kind of territorial enlargement, right? There is the EU, and it has been accepting new members. It has been developing its own resources, bureaucracy. Now the question is, how would European security look like if European integration proceeded according to functionalist blueprint? So I draw on David Mitrany. I look at David Mitrany. He was the famous advocate of functionalism in international relations. He criticized the early iterations of European integration for being too territorial, too divisive. He liked the European coal and steel community because it was focused on solving particular problems, and in principle, it could have been open to non-European countries, but he didn't like the European Economic Community because that was already too bureaucratic and too based on territory and too exclusive. So I look at the kind of blueprint that David Mitrany would have envisaged for European integration, and I see what would have happened if European integration actually proceeded according to that functionalist blueprint. Would we have the same kind of security issues that we face today? It's a bit of a speculation, of course, but that's the point of working with counterfactuals. Chapter 4 is called Problematizing the Obvious Towards a Geopolitical European Commission ? In this chapter, I revisit this idea of geopolitical European Commission in 2019, when the former defense minister of Germany, Ursula von der Leyen, was approved as the new president of the European Commission. She announced that she would like to make the European Commission more geopolitical and perhaps make the whole European Union more geopolitical. So in this chapter, I revisit what that could possibly mean, and I outline some risks associated with the European Commission becoming more geopolitical. The European Commission has evolved as a particular kind of institution and a particular kind of actor in Europe and in international relations, including international security. So I kind of want to see what kind of risks lie ahead for the EU and the Commission if the Commission becomes more geopolitical. Chapter 5, Making an Assumption, Normative Power Europe, Russia and Ukraine. So in this chapter, I revisit the notion of the European Union as a normative power. And I argue that based on how this concept was originally developed by Ian Manners and by some others, we can in fact no longer call the EU a normative power because of the way it has been reacting to first Russian hybrid warfare, but most spectacularly to the way the EU has reacted to the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. The EU doesn't meet the requirements to be considered a normative power, and in this chapter I will explain why that is the case, and of course this will be covered in one of the mini lectures that I will record for this series. Chapter 4, Reconceptualization, explaining European security governance. In this chapter, I engage with this notion of security governance and European security governance, and an argument that I make here is more of a kind of methodological one. This idea of security governance, or kind of governance in general, global governance or local governance, is often described as being kind of capable to describe reality, right? Not explain it, by describe it, right? It's a descriptive concept. And for this reason, this notion of governance has been criticized in the past. In this chapter, I argue that if we change the way we think about this description and explanation, and especially if we apply this notion of explanation by concept, then we can kind of change the way we think about security governance, and it will make sense to also think about this concept as explanatory, not just descriptive one. I look at the European security governance, and I look at the cases of Somali piracy of the coast, of the maritime piracy of the coast of Somalia, and I also look at the question of nuclear weapons in Russia, and the kind of international system of governance of assisting Russia with securing those nuclear weapons after the Cold War. Finally, chapter 7 is called Research-Informed Teaching and Assessment in European Studies. This chapter is different from all the other chapters. It talks about teaching. It talks about pedagogy in European studies, and specifically I engage here with the concept of research-informed teaching or research-based teaching in European studies, what it is, how it relates to the existing way of teaching in undergraduate education, how it can look like, and I share the results of my own experience of adopting research-based approach to teaching a module. One of my modules I specifically designed around this research-based methodology. I had some successes with it, but also some failures. I talk about the failures a lot, and I also explain how I revised the module to make it better. So this is what this chapter is mainly about. So this is the table of contents for the book. Of course, I will discuss each of these chapter contributions in my subsequent video lectures. But here, I want to say a few words about the methodological contribution of the book. Now, the question is, what do we do when we start a new research project? What do we do when we start working on a new book or a new article in an academic journal? What I observe here, and it's not really an original observation, is that we often aim to contribute to the existing literature. We aim to contribute to what already exists. We aim to fill some kind of gap. There is something missing in the existing literature. There is something that we feel is under-researched, or perhaps has not been paid a lot of attention to, and we are going to fill that gap. This is what we typically want to do. In this book, in this chapter, I argue that contributing to the existing literature is by all means a legitimate way of starting a new research. But what I specifically want to do here, and this may be kind of especially interesting to PhD students and early career researchers, is to show different ways in which we can adopt other kinds of approaches. So the argument that I make here in the book draws on two books. One is by Andrew Abbott, and it's called Methods of Discovery, Heuristics for the Social Sciences. And the other one is called is written by Jörgen Sandberg and Mats Alvesson, and is called Constructing Research Questions, Doing Interesting Research. So both of those books argue is that contributing to existing literature is one way of asking research questions and doing research, but it's not the only one, and perhaps often not even the most interesting one. There are more interesting ways of conducting research. And what they argue is that we should engage with what Abbott calls non-additive heuristics. Non-additive heuristics. Essentially, the concept sounds perhaps a little kind of convoluted or complicated, but it's quite simple. There are ways of doing research which go beyond contributing to existing literature. They involve doing something different. And the main way in which we can conduct research is to problematize the assumptions underpinning existing research. So we don't fill the gaps. We don't contribute as such to the existing literature with some new theoretical kind of perspective on a problem or some new empirical information, but instead we take what is taken for granted in existing literature, and we problematize it, and we say, okay, actually what I'm going to do here is to critique the very foundations, some of the kind of key ideas on which this body of scholarship kind of rests, right? So and I do it in one of the chapters, in the chapter on the European Commission, where I say, okay, there may be a consensus, especially in Brussels, about why it is worthwhile and desirable for the European Commission to become more geopolitical, but I'm going to problematize that assumption, right? So instead of just asking how to make the European Commission more geopolitical or how to make the whole EU more geopolitical, we may revisit the very assumption here and ask whether it in fact is desirable for the European Commission to be more geopolitical. I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying that there are risks to be considered and perhaps addressed. There are other examples of working with non-additive heuristics. One is making things static or putting things in motion, right? So this is what I do in chapter 2, Stopping the Clock. Has European security evolved since the end of the Cold War, right? We typically think about the process of European security since the end of the Cold War as a dynamic process, as a process that is in motion. So what I do here is I'm changing the narrative here. I'm arguing something else. I'm arguing something different. I'm saying that actually we can stop the clock. We can see the whole process as static. We can argue that European security has in fact not evolved since the end of the Cold War, right? So it's not just about the actual argument, right? Problematizing the actual arguments and assumptions. It's all about how we tell this story of research, how we tell this story of something, right? So again, Abbott in particular elaborates about all those non-additive heuristics in the book Methods of Discovery, Heuristics for the Social Sciences. Finally, the final example I'll mention here is the one that I already mentioned, counterfactuals. What if kinds of questions, counterfactuals, right? What if something happened in the past? Would we see similar results to the ones we see in the actual real world manifesting themselves? What if we altered something in the past? Would we see the same kind of outcome? And there are kind of good guides and interesting guides on how to do counterfactual research. But I will stop here. Well, thank you for listening, and I hope to see you back for my second mini lecture.